Howdy folks, Tom Barbley here. I've got about 20 minutes to record this, so I thought I'd set up the video camera. Apologies for the lack of air conditioning. Thank you to the people that called that out in the last video. I do actually have a fan above me, which I can normally turn on, but for these kind of videos, I have to talk to the camera, and I don't have the benefit of Google's sound, whatever they do, to eliminate the fan sound. Anyway, so this is a very difficult story for me to tell because it relates to Australia in the 1990s, which, unless you were there in Australia in the 1990s, makes absolutely no sense to this. But there was a product called Macro Media, or Macro. Well, Macromedia was basically what became of a series of different technologies, and a friend of mine called Jamie Fenton was actually responsible for this. She was the co-creator of this whole technology company. Um, and at the time, I was working with the Australian Film Commission. The Australian Film Commission actually funded me to work on my simulation work, and they were the first funders actually that gave me money to get a Mac, a colour Mac, which was just absolutely amazing technology. And I worked out to get the video card drivers that if I wrote basically pixels across the top of the screen, when I could see the pixels finally emerging at the top of the screen out of the little curves that were on the screen, that I could change the video card and get the video card to a very specific pattern where I could do real-time, only 8-bit graphics with color maps. So it looked like it was much better resolution than it actually was, or much better color depth than it actually was. So I wrote this software and I demoed it for the Australian Film Commission. Now, the Australian Film Commission at the time was advising people to use Macromedia to create these what I'd call hypercard stacks, because that's basically what it reminded me of. The technology was like hypercard, and you had all these movies that played and all this other kind of stuff. So the idea was there was a game called Myst. People might remember the game called Myst that used Macromedia Director, I think, in order to create this game where people kind of wandered through and solved problems and puzzles and this kind of stuff. So there was a whole group of people in Australia that were making these things, including a friend of mine called Nick Gaffney, who ran the Insect Collective, or actually the Insect Collective was my friend Mark Simpson and Nick Gaffney. Mark Simpson has actually watched these videos. He might actually be a subscriber to this channel, so I'm going to tell this story for the benefit of Dr. Adams on one extreme and Mark Simpson on the other extreme, and hopefully if Nick Gaffney ever sees this video, shout outs to Nick, because they're really inspirational people that I worked with early on in Australia. Anyway, I had this means of doing landscape visualization in real time, which they immediately thought were racing games that you were kind of flying over a Mars-like landscape, which was another technology that I didn't develop, but mine was associated with smooth landscapes that you could fly over and move between and all this kind of stuff, which you did in real time. So anyway, I wrote this technology, and a guy at Apple called George Warner, who's passed away recently, basically saw this technology and invited me into Apple. So from doing this graphics technology in the mid-90s, which really freaked out the Australian Film Commission, because he's like, the fellow's name was Andrew, I can't remember his name, Andrew F. Andrew F. I can't remember his name, unfortunately. Anyway, so Andrew F. at the Australian Film Commission is like, this is like a virus. You're taking over people's screens. You can't do this. Ironically, my friend Nick Gaffney had a company called Mind Virus, which was creating the approved of ways to do this with Macromedia, but I didn't do that. I had my own way of doing it. And George Warner invited me in to be at Apple for a day in 1998, which was like the most amazing thing ever, to go into Apple and see that. Now, ironically now, literally the school that my brothers went to in Australia, they fly kids over to go into .com companies, to go into West Coast companies like the one I used to work for, and just give them a talk about this is what's possible. When I was a kid growing up in Australia, it was absolutely impossible to think that I'd take this graphics technology, which was basically just a graphics driver that got frame rates, got 30 to 60 frames a second on the latest Mac technology at the time, the 1400, which was a PowerPC processor. Anyway, I'd been able to hack it. George Warner was known as a mixed mode magic scientist at the time, which meant that he had the ability to take 68,000 processor code and move it to the PowerPC. So when he saw this graphics that I was doing, he's like, you've got to come into Apple for a day. So I went into Apple for a day in 1998. I sold basically a bunch of stuff I had. I sold a computer, a violin, all my worldly possessions that were anything of note, and banked it all on coming out to the US to meet this guy at Apple. And there's a long story about my time at Apple, which really isn't the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to talk about how creating artificial life software in the mid-90s got me to Apple, which got me to the US, which then there was an article written on my software by a fellow called Douglas Rushkoff in '99, which basically got me back to the US. And it was only these little luck things that kind of came up, very thin windows of luck, that I was able to kind of exploit and get in between, which got me out of Australia in the 1990s to the US in the 2000s through the speculative technology boom. So literally 98 through to 2001. And I saw stuff through that period of time, which I would love to catalogue in video form, just as stories, but who knows who actually watches these videos. But anyway, I promised Dr. Adams that I'd record a video quickly describing how this technology, which just literally changed pixels in the corner of the screen, up until it found out what kind of screen resolution you had. Then it switched over. Then you were flying over these landscapes in real time. And now all that technology is still part of my app SDK. Well, actually, it's not the same technology at all, because the technology that I got out to the US with, I decided to bank into a partnership with a guy in Australia, which really didn't work out fabulously. But that's another story. So this is a shorter video than I anticipated. It's really not that exciting if you weren't actually there. But the Australian Film Commission was a long-standing. I used to go to their offices, which were in St Kilda, which was a very interesting area in Sydney at the time. Continued to be an interesting area. Actually, when John Draper Crunch, the phone hacker, came to live in Australia briefly, which he did in 1995, he lived in St Kilda for a period of time. But yeah, there are lots of stories like this, and I don't know whether I utilise this channel to expand those stories or whether I just hold on to them. But anyway, I wanted to shout out Jamie Fenton, who I met in later life. Like, my ability to actually develop technology and then meet the people who were behind the technology that I was developing against. Like, for example, I wrote a decryptor for PDF 1.4, if you remember PDF 1.4. No one does. But there was an encryption algorithm in PDF 1.4, which was really difficult to write around. But I reverse engineered it. I got working at the company. Now we're talking 2001, when I was in the UK. And I actually met the guy who developed the Adobe technology for this PDF 1.4 encryption, which literally cost me a good portion of my time in the UK and probably a good portion of my hair, because I was literally pulling out my hair through implementing this thing. But anyway, as luck would have it, I would meet this person. As luck would have it, I would meet Jamie Fenton, who's just an amazing technologist and responsible for so much like seminal work in technology. If you Google Jamie Fenton, you get to see her trajectory basically associated with all these technologies. And to meet Jamie was just like a standout, like, this is the person who created Macromedia, which I was literally trying to reverse engineer or even do better than in the mid-90s, which got me into Apple. Anyway, it seemed like a longer story at the time when I thought about it, but it was a pretty cool experience. And shout outs to Dr. Adams for prompting me to actually start telling the story. Myst was the technology that I had to go back and find in a very roundabout fashion. Like, I've left little breadcrumbs through my life that if I forget what Myst was, then I go back and watch a particular video or a particular movie. Actually, it was in a movie, and I was like, okay, so if I forget what it is, at least I can go back to that movie. I can watch the movie. I can tell people what that movie was if they're interested. But if you remember Myst, you remember that technology, you remember the early 2000s, films that came out in the early 2000s, you may actually know what film I'm talking about. Anyway, Tom Bubbly in Las Vegas, Nevada. Strangely, the last monkey standing who remembers this stuff. And for folks who remember the stuff back in Australia, for folks who remember the stuff in the US at that time, these are privileged memories that I'm happy to have. Anyway, Tom Bubbly in Las Vegas, Nevada, telling a much shorter story than it actually turned out to be. Signing out.